have you ever noticed the quietest hours are sometimes the loudest? You're lying in bed. It's 3 a.m. No noise, no movement, and yet your eyes open. Your mind stirs, as if some invisible hand gently tapped you on the shoulder. Why does it happen? Why now, in the stillest part of the night, do we suddenly awaken? In the West, we often call it insomnia, problem. But what if it's something else entirely? What if it's not a flaw, but a whisper? Today, we're stepping into that sacred space between night and dawn to explore a simple truth from the Buddha. Change is not the enemy, it's the invitation. We'll walk through 5 quiet thresholds, from the body's subtle shifts to the soul's unspoken longings. And somewhere in that journey, you may find that waking up at 3 a.m. isn't a mistake at all, but a moment your heart's been waiting for. Stay with me till the end, because I'll share a Zen parable about a monk, a mirror, and a silence that healed more than any sleep ever could. If you're curious, come sit with me in this gentle hour. And if you'd like to keep walking this path together, feel free to subscribe, not just to a channel, but to a shared journey of awareness. Chapter 1. When the body becomes the teacher, a gentle awakening at 3 a.m. I used to think something was wrong with me. There was a season in my life, not long ago, when I began waking up at 3 a.m. almost every night. Not because of a bad dream, not from the sound of a siren or a neighbor's late-night music. Just woke up, as if summoned by some invisible bell. The room would be completely still, like time itself had paused. The kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat, and even your thoughts seem to echo off the walls. And I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of nothing. My first reaction? Worry. Then frustration. Then, if I'm honest, a strange sense of shame. Why am I awake? What's wrong with my body? Why can't I sleep like I used to? That's when I met Harold. Well, I didn't meet him in person, but I heard his story, and something about it felt so achingly familiar it could have been mine. Harold is 72, a gentle soul with a kind voice and the kind of laugh that makes you feel like you've been friends for decades. For most of his life, Harold slept like a rock, solid, reliable, unbothered. But in the last few years, the rhythm changed. He'd find himself waking, almost like clockwork, just before the birds began their first tentative songs. And at first, he panicked, just like I did. That feeling that something invisible has shifted inside you is unsettling, especially when it comes without warning. But Harold, being the curious and thoughtful man he is, didn't just leave it at confusion. He started to ask deeper questions. He began to listen not just to doctors or articles, but to his own body, to the quiet messages in that early morning stillness. What he discovered changed everything. You see, when we're young, our bodies are flush with melatonin, that gentle, natural hormone that lulls us into sleep like a mother humming to a baby. It helps us drift off, stay asleep, and wake up feeling restored. But as we age, that hormone begins to quietly recede, like the tide pulling back from the shore. Not all at once, but gradually, softly. And the result? We sleep lighter. We wake more often, especially in the deep hours of the night when the world is still wrapped in shadows. Now here's the beautiful part. In the West, we often treat this like a problem, something to fix, a disorder, a failure. But in Buddhism, change isn't seen as something to fear. It's seen as the essence of life itself. The Buddha taught that all conditioned things are impermanent. That includes our minds, our bodies, our emotions, even our sleep patterns. And when we see this with wisdom, suffering begins to loosen its grip. Harold began to understand this. He stopped fighting those early awakenings. He made simple, gentle shifts. No more phone before bed. He took evening walks, letting the moonlight guide his steps like a lantern through the dark. He darkened his room. He softened his expectations. And in that surrender, something magical happened. He stopped seeing 3 a.m. as an enemy. He started seeing it as a teacher. I remember one evening he told me, "That hour, it feels like a threshold, like life giving me a doorway I never noticed before." That stayed with me. It made me wonder how many times in life we label something as wrong, just because it doesn't look the way it used to? How often do we grip the past so tightly that we forget to welcome the present? Aging isn't a defect. It's a symphony of changes, some loud, some barely audible. And sleep, it dances to that same music. In Buddhist teachings, the practice of mindfulness invites us to be with what is, without judgment. It's not about fixing every ripple on the surface. It's about learning to float. So the next time you find yourself awake at 3 a.m., take a breath. Listen, maybe even smile, because that hour, as lonely as it may seem, might be the only time your body and soul are asking you to slow down and simply notice. I often imagine that hour like a quiet temple tucked into the folds of the night. There are no tourists,
No crowds.
just the wind, the stars, and the rhythm of your own breath. Imagine this, a candle flickering softly on a nightstand, a half-open window letting in the cool breath of dawn, the hush of the world holding its breath. You sitting upright in bed, no longer fighting sleep, but simply being awake. There's a kind of peace in that moment that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask for attention. It's the kind of peace that slips in through the cracks, unnoticed, until you realize you've been holding it all along. Of course, that doesn't mean the frustration disappears overnight. Some mornings you'll still feel tired. Some nights you'll toss and turn. But now there's space to respond rather than react. You might use that time to meditate, to breathe, to stretch your legs and drink some warm tea, or just to lay there, hand on your heart, and whisper gently to yourself, this too is okay, because the truth is, we aren't meant to remain unchanged. Like a tree that bends with the wind or a stream that shifts with the stones, our lives are in constant motion. The older we grow, the more we're invited into this dance of change. And sleep is just one more partner in that dance. Harold didn't go back to sleeping like he did in his 30s, and neither did I. But what we both found was something far more precious than 8 straight hours of unconsciousness. We found presence. We found reverence. We found that the quietest hours of the night held the deepest kind of wisdom, if only we stopped trying to rush past them. And maybe that's the real gift of aging, not that we become perfect, but that we become spacious. That we finally have room to let go of what was, and gently hold what is. In a world that tells us to always be doing, maybe 3 a.m. is life's way of reminding us to simply be, to sit, to breathe, to feel the heartbeat of this human experience, and to remember that even in the middle of the night, even in the strange spaces where our old rhythms no longer apply, we are not broken. We are becoming. So if you ever find yourself in that hush of 3 a.m., eyes open, heart beating, unsure why, try this. Place a hand gently over your chest. Close your eyes and whisper, "Thank you, old friend. I'm listening." Because maybe that moment isn't here to take something from you. Maybe it's here to give you something you didn't know you needed. Chapter 2, The Quiet Rewriting of Time. When life slows down, so does the clock. I used to think time was fixed, something set in stone, marching forward with the same rhythm for everyone. But that was before I noticed my own body quietly rewriting its schedule, like an old monk sweeping the temple floor before the world wakes. Not in a hurry, just following the soft tug of a new rhythm. It started subtly. I'd begin to yawn before the news ended. My body leaned toward bed long before the stars were even done blinking hello. And without quite knowing why, I began to wake earlier and earlier. Sometimes at 3 or 4 in the morning, not with panic, just with presence. The kind that feels a little unfamiliar, a little too quiet. It reminded me of something Charles once said. Charles is 68, semi-retired, the kind of man who folds his newspaper just so and waters his plants like they're old friends. He told me with a sheepish laugh, "I used to make fun of my dad for falling asleep on the couch at 8 p.m. Now I am my dad." But then he paused and added softer, "It's not a bad thing though. I think my body's just trying to tell me something." Charles had stumbled upon what many of us experience as we age. Our internal clock, what scientists call the circadian rhythm, begins to shift. It's not a mistake. It's not even particularly rare. It's called advanced sleep phase. Our bodies naturally begin nudging us toward rest earlier in the evening, and calling us back to wakefulness long before the sunrise. At first, Charles resisted. He tried staying up with late-night shows, sipping tea just to stay awake, scrolling through his phone hoping to force sleepiness back into its proper schedule. But that never worked. You see, in Buddhist practice, we're reminded gently and often, resistance is the birthplace of suffering. Not because change is bad, but because our clinging to what used to be keeps us from embracing what is. Just like holding a flower too tightly will crush it, our grip on former versions of ourselves makes it hard to receive the softness of the present moment. Charles began to shift his perspective. Instead of forcing his nights back into an old mold, he leaned into the quiet. He began reading poetry after dinner. Something about the slow rhythm of verses seemed to match the way his evenings now felt. He took short walks under the yellow-orange glow of the streetlights, listening to the way the crickets spoke when the world was hushed. He even found a kind of joy in making a warm cup of chamomile tea and watching steam curl like breath on a cold window. And when he woke at 3 a.m., instead of frowning at the clock, he greeted the hour like an old friend who'd stopped by unannounced. Not always convenient, but never unwelcome. He told me once, "It's funny, I used to think waking up at that hour meant I was broken. But now I kind of look forward to it. There's something sacred about that stillness." I knew what he meant. There's a particular kind of peace that only exists in the early morning. The kind that's hard to find once emails start buzzing and coffee machines begin whirring. 3 a.m., even the moon feels like it's listening. There's no rush, no pressure, just breath, just presence. The Buddha once said, "Do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." But the present moment isn't always the one we planned for. Sometimes, it shows up early, wrapped in silence, wearing the unfamiliar shape of a changed sleep cycle. And maybe that's okay. I remember one morning not long ago, I'd woken up around 3:15. The world was dark and quiet, and I knew sleep wouldn't be returning anytime soon. So I wrapped myself in a blanket, lit a small candle, and boiled water for tea. The soft click of the kettle, the warmth in my hands, the flicker of the flame on the wall. It all felt like a meditation I hadn't planned for, but needed. In that moment, I wasn't tired. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't waiting for anything to change. I was simply there. And I thought about how strange it is that we measure health by how well we fit into a rigid schedule. As if being awake at 3 a.m. is a defect instead of a doorway. Sometimes the soul needs quiet. Sometimes the body moves to a slower rhythm because it finally can. And sometimes peace comes not from sleeping through the night, but from learning to wake with grace. This new rhythm of aging, of sleeping earlier and rising sooner, isn't a mistake in the system. It's the system evolving. It's your body whispering, "Hey, life is quieter now. Let's listen to that." And there's humor in it too, if we're willing to see it. Charles once laughed as he told me, "I used to be a night owl. Now, I'm more like an evening pigeon." We both cracked up at that one. There's something freeing about not taking yourself too seriously when your body changes. Humor softens the sting of nostalgia. It invites us to dance a little with time, rather than wrestle it. What I love about Buddhist wisdom is that it never says, "This shouldn't be happening." It says, "This is happening. So how will you meet it? Will you meet it with resistance and regret, or with curiosity and compassion?" Charles chose the latter. And in doing so, his entire experience shifted, not just his sleep, but his mood, his mornings, his relationship with aging itself. He began lighting incense before sunrise and journaling for a few minutes. Not pages, just a few lines. Thoughts like smoke rising, soft and fleeting. He began to see those hours not as empty, but as abundant, full of time to reflect, stretch, breathe, and just be. When I think of Charles now, I picture his quiet home under a blanket of moonlight, the warm glow of a reading lamp, the steam of a kettle curling upward like a prayer. A man seated by the window, not trying to fall back asleep, but simply watching the dark turn slowly into light. And I wonder, what if we all allowed our bodies to lead the way more often? What if instead of telling ourselves what should be, we listened to what is? Maybe, just maybe, the shift in our rhythm isn't the end of something. Maybe it's the beginning of a softer, wiser way to move through the world. So the next time you wake up before the sun, don't rush to fix it. Make tea, light a candle, write a line or two about the dream you half remember. Sit in silence. Let the night hold you a little longer. And then, when the birds begin to sing, smile, because you were awake for it, because your body, in all its quiet wisdom, brought you right to the edge of something sacred. And because sometimes, being awake isn't a problem. It's a gift. Chapter 3, When the Body Whispers, Learning to Listen in the Stillness. I used to think discomfort was a problem, something to fix, to avoid, to smooth out like wrinkles on a pillow. But the older I get, the more I've come to understand. It's often the body's way of saying, please, just listen. There was one night, I remember it so clearly, that this realization hit me like soft rain on temple tiles. It was around 3 a.m., the kind of silence that presses gently against the windows. I had woken up again, not startled, but aware. My hip ached, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to whisper for attention. I shifted, adjusted the blanket, but the ache stayed. And for some reason that night, instead of reacting with irritation, I laid a hand over my hip and quietly asked it, "What do you need?" I know that might sound silly, but there was something sacred in that moment, like offering tea to a tired guest within myself. That's when Eleanor came to mind. Eleanor is 76, a retired music teacher who still hums softly when she walks. She's graceful in that way certain people are, not because they try to be, but because they've spent their lives listening. To children, to music, to silence. But recently, Eleanor had found herself waking every night at 3 a.m. Not from dreams, not from fear, just thirsty. At first, she chalked it up to age. Then came the spiral of worry. What's wrong with me? Why can't I stay asleep like I used to? It wasn't until she brought it up at a routine checkup that her doctor gently pointed out that one of her medications was affecting her hydration. A few small changes, drinking more water earlier in the day, adjusting the timing of her pills, and suddenly, sleep came easier again. But as she told me this story over tea, she paused and said something I won't forget. It wasn't just the water, she said. It was how I had to stop blaming my body and start listening to it. That stayed with me. We live in a world that trains us to see the body like a machine, always supposed to work smoothly without complaint. And when it doesn't, we either panic or ignore it. But Buddhist wisdom invites us to a different relationship. It teaches us to see the body not as a machine, but as a field, a garden. And gardens, as we know, need tending. Not just when they bloom, but especially when they wilt. The Buddha once said, "The body is a vehicle for awakening. Treat it with care." So when you wake up with a stiff shoulder, when your knees throb like distant thunder, when your throat feels dry, or your skin restless, or your breath shallow, what if that's not your body failing? What if it's your body asking, "Can we talk?" It's humbling, isn't it? To realize that aging isn't the body breaking down. It's the body becoming more honest, less willing to mask discomfort, more willing to speak plainly. And those 3 a.m. wake-ups, they're not interruptions, they're invitations. I remember a moment with my own mother, a woman who never complained about pain, even when she should have. One night she called me. It was late. She couldn't sleep. Her joints ached. We sat on the phone for a while, not saying much, just breathing together. Finally, I said, "Mom, what if your body's just trying to have a conversation?" She chuckled, tired but amused, and said, "Well, it could have picked a better time." But then she got quiet and softer, and she said, "You know, maybe I haven't been listening as much as I should." That night, she laid out her heating pad, did a few stretches, drank a small glass of warm water with honey. And when she woke the next morning, she said she felt more rested, not because her pain was gone, but because she had met it with kindness instead of resistance. That's the shift, isn't it? Pain will come, discomfort will visit, the body will age and change and creak like old wooden floorboards in a temple. But the suffering, that only stays if we forget to meet it with love. I think often about the phrase, "This too is part of the path." Even the aching hip, even the dry mouth, even the frequent trips to the bathroom in the middle of the night. They're not detours from our spiritual journey. They are the journey. In Buddhist psychology, there's a practice called Vedana, the mindfulness of feeling tone. Noticing whether something feels pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Noticing, not reacting, not judging. So when the body aches at night, we can pause, breathe, notice, ask gently, what am I feeling right now? And how can I meet that feeling with compassion? Sometimes it means adjusting a pillow. Sometimes it means walking slowly to the kitchen for a sip of water. Sometimes it just means placing a hand over your heart and whispering, "I'm here, I hear you." And slowly that compassion changes everything. I've started keeping a small journal by my bedside. I call it Night Thoughts. Some entries are just one line. Others are longer. Sometimes I jot down the ache I'm feeling. Other times, it's a memory that surfaced while I lay in the dark. A dream fragment, a longing. But even that small act of writing something down helps me turn the discomfort into connection. A warm teacup, a flickering candle, the hush of breath. These become companions in the night. The strange. But when we stop seeing discomfort as the enemy, we start finding intimacy in it. We begin to care for ourselves in the way we might care for a loved one. When a child wakes in the night crying, we don't scold them, we hold them. And perhaps the work of aging is learning to hold ourselves in that same way. Eleanor now keeps a routine that honors her body's new rhythm. She drinks most of her water before dinner, takes her medications a bit earlier, and she stretches every evening to soften the tension in her shoulders. She still wakes sometimes, but now she lights a small lamp, wraps herself in a shawl, sips a bit of ginger tea. She no longer blames the night or her body. She simply says, "Okay, I'm here." And maybe that's the real healing we're all looking for. Not in fixing every ache, but in responding with presence. So if tonight or any night you find yourself stirred from sleep, pause. Don't reach for the clock right away. Don't rush to label it. Just notice what's whispering in your body, what's asking for your care. And can you, just for this moment, offer it? Not perfectly, not with grand solutions, just with gentleness. Because sometimes that's all it takes. The lotus doesn't bloom because we force it. It blooms when the conditions are soft, when the soil is wet, when the sun is warm, when there's space. And your body, even in its discomfort, is still blooming in its own way. All it's asking is that you stay close. Chapter 4, When Days Grow Softer. How the shape of life shapes the night. I used to think my sleep had a mind of its own. I'd go to bed at a decent hour, feel fine when I closed my eyes, and yet, without fail, I'd wake up at 3 in the morning. Not once or twice, but night after night. I didn't feel panicked, just awake and confused, almost like I had missed some invisible memo from my body. Then one day, I realized something so simple, I almost laughed out loud. It wasn't just my nights that had changed. It was my days. You see, I'd recently shifted into a slower season of life. Work had lightened. My daily routine, once packed with meetings, deadlines, and errands, had quietly thinned out. I ate dinner earlier, started tidying up the house before sunset, and most evenings, I found myself already yawning by the time the evening news began. In the stillness of those quieter evenings, it felt like my body was gently pulling me inward, asking for rest long before I was used to giving it. So I began going to bed earlier, thinking it was just a temporary phase. But when I started waking up at 3 a.m. like clockwork, I couldn't help but wonder, is this normal? And that's when I remembered Walter. Walter is one of those people who carries peace around like a sweater he never takes off. Soft-spoken, silver-haired, with eyes that crinkle when he smiles. He had just entered retirement when his sleep started to shift. The buzz of professional life was gone. The daily hustle had been replaced by slow breakfasts, bird watching from his porch, and long, meandering walks with no particular destination. At first, Walter found it charming, peaceful, even until the 3 a.m. wake-ups began. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't in pain. He simply woke, fully alert, long before the sun had made its way over the trees. He told me, "At first, I thought my body was broken, like something got unplugged when I left the office for the last time. But it wasn't broken. It was adapting." And once he realized that, he stopped trying to fix it and started trying to understand it. What we often forget is that our sleep is not a separate life. It's not sealed off in a different room from how we live during the day. It's deeply intertwined, like roots under the soil. Buddhism teaches that everything is connected. Our breath, our actions, our thoughts, and yes, our schedules. So if our days become quieter, less structured, more inward, our nights follow suit. Walter began to notice the subtle habits that were shaping his sleep. The early dinners, the TV naps, the lack of bright light in the evenings. All these things, small, innocent, even comforting, were nudging his internal clock forward without him even realizing. And in Buddhist philosophy, there's this beautiful teaching: what we practice, we become. If we practice rising early, we'll become early risers. If we practice gentleness during the day, our nights will mirror that stillness. And if we practice mindfulness, well, then even a 3 a.m. wake-up can become a moment of grace. Walter didn't overhaul his life. He didn't panic and start chasing sleep supplements or forcing himself to stay up till midnight. He made tiny, thoughtful shifts. A 10-minute walk after sunset, a call to an old friend in the early evening, switching off the television and reading poetry instead. And gradually something softened. He still woke early, but not as abruptly. Not with a jolt, but with a kind of tender alertness. Like the sky before dawn, gently exhaling light. One evening, he told me, "I stopped treating my sleep like a light switch. It's more like a tide now. It rises, it falls. It listens to the moon more than the clock." That image stuck with me, because it reminded me that our bodies are ancient, older than our calendars, more in tune with sunrises and birdsong than with to-do lists. There's something deeply human, deeply real, about letting your body lead the way once in a while. You can see it in the way an elderly couple sits on a bench at sunset, not speaking, just watching the sky. Or the way a monk sweeps fallen leaves in a temple garden, unhurried, just following the breath. Or the golden lotus that opens just as the sky begins to dim, offering itself to the fading light without needing a reason. These aren't grand spiritual practices. They're quiet ones, subtle, but they shape the soul, and they shape the sleep. I began trying some of Walter's rituals myself, not because I was trying to fix anything, but because I wanted to be in better conversation with my life. I turned down the lights earlier, opened the window to let the night in, let myself be still, not productive, not efficient, just still for a few moments after dinner. Some nights, I lit a candle and watched the flame dance on the wall while sipping warm tea. Other nights, I took a walk and listened to the leaves stir in the trees, soft, like the rustling of robes in a distant monastery. And my sleep, it shifted, not dramatically, but gently. The 3 a.m. awakenings didn't disappear, but they softened. They became less about why am I awake, and more about what is this moment asking of me. Sometimes it was a reminder to stretch. Sometimes it was a nudge to write. Sometimes it was just an invitation to lie quietly and watch the moonlight spill across the floor. I realized that mindfulness isn't about controlling time. It's about honoring it. And when we honor the way our days unfold, when we stop fighting the natural rhythm of life, we begin to see our nights not as interruptions, but as reflections. If you ever feel frustrated by your sleep schedule, if you find yourself awake when the world is asleep, pause. Ask yourself gently, how have my days been unfolding? Are they rushed or quiet? Are you moving with awareness or being moved by habit? Are you honoring your energy or pushing against it? There's no shame in change. The lotus doesn't bloom at the same hour every day. It listens to the warmth of the sun, the hush of the air, the subtle cues that say, now is the time. And your sleep is no different. Maybe your early waking is not a mistake, but a message. Not a problem, but a pattern. Not a curse, but a rhythm that simply asks for your attention. So try this. Watch how your days flow. Notice when you eat, when you rest, when you laugh, when you pause, and see how those gentle patterns ripple into the night. Because perhaps the answer to your sleeplessness isn't found in the hours of darkness, but in the softness of your daylight. Chapter 5, When the Heart Whispers at Dawn. A story of longing and the still hours of the soul. I used to think the middle of the night was quiet because nothing was happening. No traffic, no doorbells, no meetings or errands to chase. Just the hush of darkness stretching across the house like a soft, forgotten blanket. But now I know it's in those hours around 3 a.m. when the heart begins to stir. Not with noise, but with memory. And sometimes memory speaks louder than any alarm clock ever could. I remember one particular night not so long ago. I had fallen asleep easily enough. But at exactly 3:07 a.m., I opened my eyes. Not startled, just awake. The room was still, except for the faint whir of the ceiling fan. A pool of moonlight spilled across the floor like spilled milk, soft and ghost-like. I turned over, then back, then again. But it wasn't my body that was restless. It was something else. A feeling I couldn't quite name, rising gently in my chest like a wave that didn't want to crash, only to be seen. It reminded me of Gloria. Gloria, who lost her husband 5 years ago. They had been married for 42. A whole lifetime carved into years of shared routines, quiet laughter, Sunday soups, and long walks holding hands with no destination. After he passed, she didn't crumble. She planted tomatoes, baked fresh bread, laughed with her grandchildren, their sticky fingers wrapped around hers. To the world, she looked okay, strong even. But the thing about grief is it waits, not impatiently, not with anger, just patiently. And Gloria told me that for her, grief came softly at 3 a.m. It's like the house breathes differently then, she said. Like everything gets quiet enough that I can finally hear what my heart's been trying to say. She didn't fight it, didn't rush to bury it. Instead, she began to treat those early hours like a sacred time. A personal temple made of silence, moonlight, and memory. She placed a journal on her nightstand, not for essays or profound reflections, just for whispers, one thought at a time, a note to her husband, a memory that had floated up, a sentence that didn't have to lead anywhere. She said, "I stopped expecting sleep to save me, and started letting wakefulness hold me." There's something deeply healing in that shift. In Western culture, we often treat emotions like messes we need to clean up. We want to be tidy, composed, over it. But Buddhist wisdom invites us into a softer truth. Emotions are not mistakes. They are teachers. And when they visit us in the quietest hour, maybe it's not insomnia at all. Maybe it's love, asking for room to breathe. The Buddha once said, "Do not run away from your pain. Face it with love and understanding." There's a kind of grace in doing that, in simply sitting with your longing, not fixing it, not analyzing it, just being there. I think of Gloria's ritual. She would make a small cup of tea chamomile, her favorite. She'd wrap herself in her late husband's sweater, the one that still faintly smelled like cedarwood and something warm. Then she'd sit by the window, not to look for answers, but to watch the moon. Sometimes, she told me, I just tell the moon everything I wish I could still say to him, and somehow it helped. Not in a grand, transformative way, but in a quiet, ordinary way that made 3 a.m. feel less like a prison and more like a doorway into herself. I've come to believe that emotional restlessness is often the heart's way of asking to be heard. Not judged, not silenced, just acknowledged. So many of us carry unspoken things. The ache of someone lost, a regret, a sentence we never got to finish. These pieces don't disappear. They wait for space. And in the hush of the night, when the world stops asking us to be busy, those pieces rise like lanterns on still water. And in that space, if we're willing, we can practice one of the most powerful kinds of mindfulness. The mindfulness of feeling, to sit with sorrow, to breathe with longing, to listen to our hearts the way we would listen to a beloved friend. I once kept trying to journal my way out of my own emotional restlessness. I wanted to understand it, solve it, finish it. But one night, I just wrote a single line. I miss someone, and that's okay. And then I closed the notebook and cried. But they weren't sharp tears, not jagged, just soft, like rain falling on the roof of a monastery, like something inside me was being rinsed. There's no shame in feeling deeply. There's no expiration date on grief or longing. Emotions don't obey calendars. They don't ask permission. They arrive when they're ready, and they leave when they're done. And Buddhist practice invites us not to cling to them, but not to push them away either. To see them, to thank them, to let them be part of our path. So if you find yourself awake at 3 a.m., heart fluttering with emotion you can't name, I invite you to try what Gloria did. Don't force yourself back to sleep. Don't scold yourself for being too emotional. Just make a cup of tea. Write one line. Look at the moon. Put your hand on your heart and whisper, I'm here. I'm listening. And maybe that's all your heart needed. To be listened to be held gently, like a lotus floating on still water. Sometimes that's enough to let the emotion pass. Other times it stays a while, but at least now it has company, and the ache becomes less of a wound and more of a doorway. I've come to see 3 a.m. not as a mistake, but as a kind of holy hour, a time when the world is silent enough to hear the deeper parts of ourselves. And sometimes the heart just needs to speak, not loudly, not forever, just for a moment. And maybe, just maybe, the moon is listening too. So maybe being awake at 3 a.m. isn't a problem to solve. Maybe it's the soul's way of knocking softly, asking if you're still listening, not to the noise of the world, but to the quiet inside you. We often think sleep should be perfect, uninterrupted, like a clean line on a graph. But life doesn't work that way, and neither do we. Like a golden lotus that only opens before dawn, like the hush in a temple before a single bell rings. These early hours carry something sacred, if we're willing to receive it. So I'll leave you with this. When the night wakes you, don't rush to close your eyes again. Open your heart instead. And tell me, have you ever found peace, not in falling asleep, but in finally waking up to yourself? I'd love to hear your story. What do your 3 a.m. moments hold? Share in the comments below. I read each one like a letter from a friend. And if this quiet journey meant something to you, I invite you to subscribe. Not as an obligation, but as a soft commitment to keep exploring life's gentle truths together. Until next time, may you meet the silence with compassion, and may the moon always find you listening.